Okay, it is now my great pleasure to introduce you to Chad Williams, our next speaker. Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of African and Afro-American Studies at Brandeis University. Chad earned his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate in history from Princeton University, certainly one of our very finest universities. He previously taught at Hamilton College, before arriving to Brandeis in 2012. He specializes in African American and modern U.S. history, African American military history, the World War I era, and African American intellectual history. His first book, Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in World War I Era, was published in 2010 by University of North Carolina Press. Widely praised as a landmark study, Torchbearers of Democracy won the 2011 Liberty Legacy Foundation Award from the OAH, the 2011 Distinguished Book Award from the Society for Military History, and designation as a 2011 Choice Outstanding Academic Title. Chad has published articles and book reviews in numerous leading journals and collections. He has earned fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Ford Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. But don't hold that against him. The Woodrow Wilson Foundation does all kinds of amazing stuff. Really, it does. We really didn't think of the main theme of this weekend to be how to bash Woodrow Wilson. It really was not what we were thinking. He's currently completing a study of W.B. Du Bois' historical writings on World War I. Please give Chad Williams a warm welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Paul, for that very generous introduction. It's truly a pleasure to be here. I have learned so much just as a student of World War I. This is really a treat, just the distinguished lineup of speakers, the conversations, the questions that have been taking place have been truly stimulating. Feel free to ask me about Woodrow Wilson. I was just at Princeton yesterday on a panel on Woodrow Wilson's legacy on race, so I'm revved up, ready to go. It's nice to be in a room full of Woodrow Wilson haters, so that's good. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this presentation and this discussion. So many of the other presentations have laid out the issues so beautifully. Paul's a tough act to follow. And I really appreciate his presentation because it speaks to, I think one of the main reasons why we're here is how do we teach military history and the challenges of teaching military history, especially to a generation of students who, rightfully so, may be very cynical about the meaning of military history, about war and military service itself. So to see military documents come alive in the way that Paul presented them is really very exciting. And it makes me think about what other pedagogical approaches we take to teaching military history. I actually teach a course on African American military history at Brandeis University, and oftentimes I struggle attracting students to the class. So these larger issues which bring us here at this conference are really important. When I teach about military history, and specifically the history of African Americans in the military, there are really kind of three things that I keep in mind in how I go about approaching my subject matter. One is the importance of telling a good story. Right? And I think we've seen some examples of really good storytelling here today. The importance of telling a story and of also finding the right person to function as the narrative device to tell that story, right? The Alvin York and how focusing on his experience kind of brings the history to life. So the importance of good storytelling. After all, that's what historians are. Well, that's what we should be, at least. Second is, what are the big themes that we want to emphasize? What are the central themes in that story that we want our students to come away with, right? The big picture questions, the difficult questions that we want them to grapple with. And third, how is that story relevant? How do we make history relevant to our students' lives today? Right? And I think that's a particular challenge for the First World War. Certainly since the start of the World War I centennial, I've been giving a lot of thought about the teaching of World War I and just why World War I matters, right? Why did the war happen? Right? Why is it that the First World War, especially on this side of the Atlantic, is oftentimes treated as a forgotten war? For our purposes this afternoon, what role did the United States play in the war? What changes did the war bring about to American society? What are its legacies today? And of course, what did the war mean for African Americans and other peoples of African descent? So how to tell that story? W.E.B. Du Bois. I have no doubt that if he were alive today, W.E.B. Du Bois would be asking many of the same questions that I just asked and many more. One of the founding figures of the modern civil rights movement and arguably the greatest black intellectual in American history, Du Bois occupies a central place in the history and legacy of World War I for African Americans. He not only lived through the war, recognizing it as a defining moment in his political and intellectual career, but also spent decades grappling with its troubling and at times confounding memory. A century later, we are still trying to understand, just like Du Bois, how best to tell the story of African Americans in the war, what are the central themes of that story, and just why that story matters. And one of the stories I like to tell is how I came up with the title of my book. Let me see if I can get this. Where should I be? Whoops. Okay, there's my book. Yeah, it's a pretty good book. Check it out. Torchbearers of Democracy. So I was doing research in the Du Bois papers at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and came across a letter in Du Bois's papers. It was written by an unnamed gentleman to Du Bois, and he described black soldiers as, and I'm quoting, torchbearers to make the world safe for democracy. I just thought this would be a great title for my dissertation, and I just ran with it. But as I began to delve into the subject matter more deeply, and as I eventually worked on my book, I was compelled to take a step back and really think very long and hard about what that meant. In what ways were African American soldiers torchbearers of democracy? So preparing for this talk this afternoon, reflecting on the significance of the centennial, grappling with the meaning of our current racial moment as well. All these factors have again compelled me to revisit this question. Indeed, what lessons can we draw from the years of the First World War to perhaps better understand the meaning of democracy as well as struggles for racial justice today? President Woodrow Wilson famously asserted that the United States entered the war to make the world safe for democracy. And when he spoke these words, he tapped into a very powerful political discourse. And I'm almost reluctant to give Wilson a little credit here, so don't get too mad at me, because he excited the imaginations of people from all different types of background, unintentionally, but he did nevertheless. And this spoke to how democracy was and still is a very highly elusive term. It meant and continues to mean different things to different people. Throughout American history, democracy has been a work in progress. It has been deeply flawed, inconsistent, all too often blatantly contradictory. But it was something that African Americans staked claim to, insisted upon, and forcefully demanded. Moreover, African Americans reimagined just what democracy itself should be and worked to transform it into reality that spoke to the individual and collective aspirations of black people for equal citizenship and, most important, recognition as human beings. And African American soldiers, as well as veterans, so I'm going to span both the war and the post-war period in my talk, they stood at the front lines of this struggle. As Jennifer was saying earlier, and we really could have switched places on the program. She's done amazing work looking at the experiences of African American soldiers, as well as other soldiers of African descent, deeply embedded to her scholarship. Some 400,000 black soldiers fought and labored in a segregated United States Army. Over 200,000 Black servicemen traveled to France. 2 all-black divisions fought on the front lines. Thousands of black troops received medals of commendation. After the war, African-American veterans, both physically and symbolically, shaped what would come to be known as the New Negro movement. The experiences of African-American soldiers and what they represented allows us to develop a deeper understanding of how the war fundamentally shaped the social, cultural, and political terrain of black life during the World War I era. W.E.B. Du Bois certainly knew this. Even more importantly, the history of black soldiers and veterans provides us with a powerful example of how African Americans a century after the war have and continue to fight for democracy in the United States. Now, one of the central questions that historians continue to wrestle with is, what was the First World War about? Just what was this war about? What were the causes of this maelstrom that would ultimately lead to over 17 million deaths? From the moment the guns erupted in August 1914, W. Du Bois made the explicit connection between the World War and the African diaspora, and specifically the African continent. On his first musings about the conflict in a November 1914 crisis editorial titled World War and the Color Line, Du Bois warned his readers against, quote, supposing that the present war is far removed from the color problem of America. He went further to argue that the cause of the war lay in, quote, the wild quest for imperial expansion among the colored races, between the rival European nations and the theory of the inferiority of the darker peoples that legitimized their actions. And he would expand on this further in another essay titled The African Roots of War, which appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. He wrote, yet in a very real sense, Africa is a prime cause of this terrible overturning of civilization which we have lived to see. He could point to the use of African colonial subjects as both laborers and, in the case of France, as soldiers on the Western Front as prime evidence of his claim. While Du Bois understood the democratic meaning of the war in the broader context of Africa and its diaspora, most African Americans remained principally concerned with the crisis of democracy facing black people in the United States. Indeed, it is crucial to not forget just how divorced democracy was, how divorced it had become from the lives of most African Americans on the eve of World War I. Jim Crow segregation, systematic disenfranchisement, debt peonage, horrific racial violence. This was indeed the nadir, as the pioneering African-American historian and a World War I veteran, Rayford Logan, would note. In April of 1917, it's fair to say that black people were, in effect, citizens in name only. But the ideals of democracy continued to resonate for African Americans. It remained a powerful aspiration, one rooted in a history of struggle dating back to the antebellum period. The spark, democratic hope that black people could one day be seen and treated as full American citizens and equal participants in American democracy remained very much alive. And this is a picture of a group of early civil rights activists, Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells in the front row amongst other black leaders, forerunners to what would become the NAACP. So with this in mind, with this history in mind, perhaps Woodrow Wilson indeed should have thought a little bit more carefully about his words that he spoke on the evening of April the 2nd, 1917, when he addressed the United States Congress and issued a declaration of war against Germany. In his 36-minute speech, as we are all familiar with, he gave a truly memorable performance, solidifying America's role in the war and its supposed larger political vision when he famously proclaimed, "The world must be made safe for democracy. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them." While remarkably effective in framing what the United States would be fighting for, his speech was also a double-edged sword. Women's rights activists, organized labor, and African Americans in particular approached this so-called war for democracy as a unique opportunity to improve their respective social, political, and economic conditions relative to American democracy. Perhaps more than any other group, African Americans seized upon the blatant hypocrisy of Wilson's pledge and appropriated democracy as a rhetorical and ideological weapon in the cause of racial equality. But fighting for African American civil rights while at the same time declaring the patriotic loyalty of the race was a serious challenge, a challenge made even more painful by incidents like July 1917 East St. Louis massacre or pogrom. Literally hundreds of African Americans killed in East St. Louis. This is a picture that appeared in African American newspapers across the country, the capturing the hypocrisy of Woodrow Wilson's pledge, the pleading of African American citizens for racial justice and intervention on his behalf, intervention that would never come. W.B. Du Bois certainly captured this dilemma in his writings, especially in the controversial editorial he penned in the July 1918 issue of The Crisis, the NAACP's journal, which he edited. His editorial, Closed Ranks. And in terms of teaching tools, this is a wonderful opportunity for students to really delve into the contradictions that African Americans confronted. On the one hand, remaining loyal to their country, but at the same time remaining loyal to their race as well, and wanting to advance the cause of racial justice. Du Bois wrote, in part, "We of the colored race have no ordinary interest in the outcome. That which the German power represents today spells death to the aspirations of Negroes and all darker races for equality, freedom, and democracy. Let us not hesitate. Let us, while this war lasts, forget our special grievances, and close our ranks with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy. We make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly with our eyes lifted to the hills." Now, Du Bois received a barrage of criticism for this editorial, and I think the controversy that erupted around Du Bois's statement spoke to the fact that the so-called warring ideals that he would write about in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, the idea of being black and being American, that defined Du Bois's understanding of double consciousness, the double consciousness of African American identity, those warring ideals would not be easily reconciled, and they certainly wouldn't be easily reconciled during the war. Nevertheless, the majority of African Americans knew that democracy would indeed have to be fought for. Racial progress would require black people to place their lives on the line. And for this reason, military service, I would argue, as the highest form of patriotism, the highest form of civic obligation, and the role of African American soldiers specifically dominated both public and private debates about black participation in the war. And this is also why memory is so important. Right? The legacy of African American soldiers really going back to the American Revolution and just what African American soldiers and military service represented. Debates regarding the use of African American soldiers in the war revolved around competing historical memories of the meaning of black military service. On the one hand, African Americans drew from the inspiring memories of black sacrifice going back to the American Revolution, but also specifically pointing to the heroism of black soldiers in the Civil War, right, and their direct connection to the achievement of freedom and actual citizenship. Conversely, many white Americans, particularly those from the South, feared the potential use of black soldiers in the war based on their own historical memories of black troops, especially black troops who had served in the Civil War, who were stationed in the South during the Reconstruction period, viewing them as threats to white supremacy and the racial status quo, and also the fact that they had guns. Not a good combination. The worst nightmares of Southern whites became a reality on the night of August 24th, 1917 in Houston, Texas. After enduring weeks of racial abuse from racist white citizens and police officers, a battalion of black soldiers of the 24th Infantry, part of the regular army of the Buffalo Soldiers, stationed at Camp Logan on the outskirts of the city, struck back. Determined to enact retribution, over 100 soldiers procured weapons, deserted camp, and with guns drawn, marched into downtown Houston. For 3 hours, black soldiers ignited the streets of Houston in a fury of gunfire. When the smoke cleared, 2 black soldiers and 15 white men lay dead, including 4 police officers. Military officials promptly placed the entire battalion under arrest and subsequently court-martialed them for their actions. After the first of 3 trials, in which a total of 110 men were found guilty of mutiny, law enforcement hastily executed 13 soldiers, denying them the opportunity to appeal their judgment. A total of 19 black servicemen were ultimately hung, with 63 receiving life sentences in federal prison. So these competing views of black soldiers clashed from the outset of American involvement in the war. Indeed, questions swirled if African Americans would be able to serve in the war at all, and if so, in what capacity. Now, the War Department, I think, as we've seen, the United States was wholly unprepared to enter the war. The military was, to put it mildly, not up to speed. So the War Department realized that it didn't simply have the luxury of excluding African Americans from service altogether or severely complicating training procedures by restricting black soldiers from Southern camps. So despite some very vigorous Southern opposition, the enlistment and mobilization of black soldiers proceeded with the passage of the Selective Service Act in May of 1917, and African Americans went off to war, or at least went into the Army. And I think thinking about the meaning of progressivism during this period is really important, which was alluded to by Jennifer earlier this afternoon, how someone like Newton Baker modeled himself kind of as a progressive advocate of efficiency, and applied that idea to his management of the American Army, and specifically how he approached the race question, as it was termed at the time, or more crudely, the Negro question, the Negro problem. When we're thinking about strategy, which was discussed earlier, segregation, Jim Crow, the idea of separate but equal, was a central part of American strategy during the war. And, I'll put it even more bluntly, the maintenance of white supremacy was a central part of American strategy during the war. When we think about how segregation was promoted, how it was justified as a means of efficiency, right, as a means of military efficiency, right, then we could see, right, how it was a central part of how the United States went about building the American Expeditionary Forces, but also how it went about waging war itself. Newton Baker was explicit. He said, now is not the time to address the race question. Right? It was about maintaining the status quo in the military, right, and trying to construct an efficient army within the confines of separate but equal. Right? He was also committed to maintaining the racial customs in the Army. Right? He did not want to anger white officers, right? And as a result, right, left them effectively in charge of how black soldiers were treated, and this would have, from the perspective of many black soldiers, as well as officers, disastrous results. So this idea of military efficiency, maintaining the status quo, was central to how the American Army, how the War Department specifically approached the question of black soldiers. Right? This idea of separate but equal, but obviously black soldiers not being treated equally by any means. From the onset of the implementation of the draft, military officials and local administrators of the Selective Service System envisioned African Americans serving in an almost exclusively labor capacity. Approximately 80% of all black men in the wartime Army served as labor troops. One official bluntly described black troops as, quote, laborers in uniform. Of the 200,000 African American soldiers who served overseas in France, approximately 140,000 labored in the services of supply, loading and unloading ships, laying railroad tracks, digging ditches, salvaging battlefields, burying dead bodies and animals, all of the ugly, unglamorous work of the war, but still nevertheless absolutely essential. But if they had to serve, as many white racist military officials reason, it would be in a capacity suited to the so-called natural abilities of black men. All right, so we see the role of kind of pseudoscience, racial pseudoscience playing into how the Army is constructing itself along these supposed models of efficiency, right? The so-called natural abilities of African Americans, but kind of more perniciously, keeping African Americans in a role where they could be controlled. They actually had white officers who were recruited specifically for their talents in, quote-unquote, handling Negroes, right? Putting them in charge of African American regiments, particularly labor battalions. In thinking about the 200,000 African American soldiers who served overseas in France, and we could talk about this in the Q&A, it's important to really emphasize what a remarkable experience that was, right? Especially for many of the men who did serve in a labor capacity. Their histories, their stories oftentimes don't get told, but the act of leaving their local communities, right? Imagine being a poor sharecropper from Alabama, right? And all of a sudden you are given the opportunity to go to France, right? To see a completely different world, to experience a completely different set of social relations, to think about the meaning of race in a completely different context. It was eye-opening for thousands of black troops, right, who realized that the status quo in the United States, that American white supremacy was not necessarily the norm, that there were other possibilities out there, right? So this was remarkably enlightening for literally thousands of African American troops, and at the same time remarkably frightening for many white people, especially in the South, who feared what would happen to African Americans if they went to France, if they were exposed to these ideals, of liberty, equality, fraternity, all right? Taking them back with them after the war into the South. What would happen? So we'll get to that part of the story in a little bit. The fact that the vast majority of black soldiers carried shovels instead of rifles has played an important role in dismissing the historical contributions and legacy of black soldiers in the war. Why, for some historians, they've been unknown or lost or forgotten. I'm actually quoting some of the titles of books that have been written about African American soldiers, right? But not all black soldiers served in this capacity. The Army established 2 black combat divisions, the 92nd Division and the 93rd Division. The 92nd Division, which was composed of draftees, was born largely out of political pressure from black leaders, civil rights activists, especially in the black press, who realized the importance of African American soldiers proving their worth on the battlefield to the larger cause of black civil rights. Although commanded at the highest ranks by white officers, many of whom were deeply committed racists, the 92nd Division did in fact contain black officers. The War Department, seeking to again kind of quell some of its most ardent African American critics, agreed to the creation of an all-black officers training camp, which opened in June of 1917 in Des Moines, Iowa. Although it was segregated, which many African Americans objected to, the Des Moines training camp represented an important moment in the history of the war and in African American military history more broadly. There were 639 men who received commissions after the camp. The technical training the candidates received proved that black men had the mental ability to be quality officers. These were the cream of the crop, the best of the race who attended the Des Moines training camp. The black press dubbed the camp race leaders in the making. So this is this fascinating laboratory of using the military and the process of creating black officers as creating a new generation of race leaders. From a symbolic perspective, the presence of African American officers in the Army subverted traditional social and military racial hierarchies by empowering black men and potentially placing them in positions of authority over white soldiers. And this is why the case of Charles Young, which Jennifer mentioned earlier, was so important and really so devastating for African Americans, why he was so feared, the potential of him becoming a general, and why he was very unjustly run out of the Army, at least temporarily. He was dubbed unfit to serve for health reasons during the war, however, was reinstated to active duty after the war, where he was apparently healthy enough to serve in Liberia. And very tragically, that's where he died just a couple years after the end of the war. The Des Moines camp also, and the largest experience of African-American officers, I think, also reveals that the color line, as we think of it, was often very porous. Okay, it wasn't as strict as we oftentimes think of it. All right, so for example, after Des Moines training camps, subsequent black officers trained at officer training camps alongside white officer candidates. All right, and we could look at the experiences of black soldiers both domestically as well as in France, that while there was an attempt to maintain racial segregation, oftentimes that broke down. You had interactions taking place between white and black soldiers, right, in training camps, in YMCA huts, right, on and off the battlefield, right? Oftentimes these interactions were very important in terms of kind of showing the possibilities of a different type of race relations, but more often than not, they were very explosive as well, right, and maintaining the peace within the Army. Right, given how segregation would oftentimes break down, was a serious challenge that the military faced. So back to the 92nd Division. The 92nd Division was characterized by W.B. Du Bois as, quote, the storm center concerning black troops. It had an extremely trying experience. The various regiments of the division trained at separate facilities in the United States. The military didn't want an entire division of black soldiers stationed in one camp, so they split up the 92nd Division, preventing it from developing the cohesiveness, sense of collective identity essential for divisional success. In France, black officers were targeted by efficiency boards, demeaned by their superiors, and plagued by rumors that black soldiers in the division were guilty of a disproportionate number of rapes of French women. The 92nd Division actually became known amongst many white soldiers and officers in the AEF as the raping division. All of these charges completely unfounded. The second black fighting division, the 93rd Division, was composed mostly of National Guard units. Black National Guard units from New York, from Chicago, like the 8th Illinois, Washington, D.C., Ohio, Maryland, other places. The 93rd Division saw extensive combat duty in France, and this was primarily due to the fact that it served with the French Army. It was really given over to the French by Pershing, in part as a result of the military not knowing what to do with this group of African-American National Guardsmen and in what capacity they wanted to use them, particularly in combat. So as a result, the 93rd Division had a markedly different military and social experience than other American soldiers, both white and black. Despite being essentially discarded by the U.S. military, the 93rd Division was highly decorated, garnered widespread praise from their French comrades, many of whom actually preferred them over white American soldiers. The most famous regiment of the 93rd Division, one that gets the most attention, was the 369th Infantry Regiment, the famed New York 15th National Guard, which after the war came to be known as the Harlem Hellfighters. This was the first African-American combat unit to reach France. The 369th served for 191 consecutive days on the front without losing any ground to the German army. The question that was posed earlier about how soldiers of the 93rd Division were used in comparison to French West African colonial troops, I think is very interesting. The 369th had some of the highest casualty rates of any single regiment in the American Army, certainly the highest amongst African-American combat regiments. So I think it does raise the question how they were utilized by the French. The French were certainly eager to have fresh bodies, were not hesitant, like the AF was, to throw them into the front with very minimal training, even though I haven't seen any direct evidence that they saw the 369th and other regiments of the 93rd Division as shock troops. I think it does raise important questions about how they saw the use of black soldiers in this particular capacity. But in addition to being a very highly recognized and efficient fighting unit, they also had a wonderful jazz band also. Right? James Reese Europe, one of the most renowned ragtime conductors prior to the war, contributed to the popularity of the 369th, helped introduce France to jazz music. When we think about the birth of the jazz age, we need to point specifically to the role of African-American African-American soldiers and the regimental bands specifically. The 369th was also popularized for the heroics of two of its soldiers, Needham Roberts, there on the right, and Henry Johnson on the left, who on the night of May the 13th, 1918, routed a 24-man German raiding party. Johnson, using a combination of grenades, his bolo knife, the butt of his rifle, single-handedly killed 4 Germans and wounded another dozen. He just recently received the posthumous Medal of Honor from President Obama. This was called the Battle of Henry Johnson amongst African Americans, became front page news in the United States. Can't really see the picture all that well. Obviously, that's not what the Western Front looked like. Henry Johnson wasn't killing this German with his little penknife. It was a little more gruesome than that. But it does speak to how Henry Johnson was heroized, also sanitized, but nevertheless how he was seen as, in many ways, Black America's Alvin York. He was Black America's war hero. This was the moment that African Americans had been kind of hungrily waiting for, right? He was going to serve kind of as the perfect symbol for demonstrating how African Americans were brave, heroic, manly fighters on the battlefield, willing to sacrifice themselves. Indeed, how could anyone deny, after the Battle of Henry Johnson, that both Johnson and Roberts, who oftentimes doesn't receive the attention that he deserves, how could anyone deny that African Americans were not only heroic, but also worthy of first-class citizenship? Now, obviously, it would not be quite so simple. Memories of the 369th and other moments of heroism have in some ways and continue to engage in a struggle with a different memory of the alleged failure of Black combat soldiers and officers. The 92nd Division, again, and its Black officers specifically, were the main targets of racist white military officials. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was kind of the signal moment in how African-American soldiers were deemed as ineffective combat fighters. We can ask me more details about it, but an incident involving one particular regiment of the 92nd Division became emblematic in the hands of many white racist officers as why Black soldiers and officers in particular could not be trusted on the battlefield. The 92nd's own commanders labeled Black officers as, and I'm using their terms, worthless, inefficient, untrustworthy, cowardly, among other insults. And forgive me, Paul, for bringing up Robert Lee Bullard, commander of 1st Division, who would go on to command the American Expeditionary Force's 2nd Army. He actually wrote off the 92nd Division as a misguided experiment and wrote in his post-war memoir, and I'm quoting, "The Negro Division seems in a fair way to be a failure." going on to state that, quote, altogether, my memories of the 92nd Negro Division are a nightmare. If you need combat soldiers, and especially if you need them in a hurry, don't put your time upon Negroes. So these charges had a stinging effect, and in fact continue to inform assessments of black soldiers by some historians today. I believe an assumption still exists that African Americans somehow didn't care about their history and that the tax on their legacy and their role as soldiers in the war somehow didn't matter. But this was simply not true. African Americans, soldiers, and civilians engaged in a vigorous effort to not only redeem the memory of black service in France, but to shape it on their own terms. This began immediately after the November 1918 armistice. Black communities welcomed their soldiers home with parades and festivities throughout the country, ranging from small local gatherings to massive processions that took place in Chicago as well as in New York City. This is the homecoming parade of the 369th. The black press and political leaders hailed the service of black troops as an unqualified success and eagerly anticipated the post-war era becoming a new reconstruction, akin to the momentous transformations in the social, political, and economic status of African Americans following the Civil War. A host of black novelists, playwrights, and poets of what would come to be known as the Harlem Renaissance produced a broad range of works that invoked the recent war or had black servicemen as central characters. Several black intellectuals, most notably W.E.B. Du Bois, also attempted to enshrine the contributions of black soldiers into the quote-unquote official written history. And a handful of African-American veterans published memoirs of their individual and regimental exploits, testaments to their historical awareness and self-conscious desire to both preserve and share their experiences. So together, these acts created for African Americans a triumphant communal public memory of black service in the war that would indeed be passed down from generation to generation. But other memories existed as well, and not all of them were, of course, positive. African Americans also remembered the virulence of white supremacy, the racial discrimination that they had to endure in the Army, the hypocrisy of fighting a war for democracy. One disgruntled veteran wrote in a letter to W.B. Du Bois after the war, quote, "We were treated like dogs. I mean, worse than German prisoners. I would die before I would undertake to go through what I have gone through." Moreover, historical memories of black military service were shaped as much by events of the post-war period as by the war itself. Black soldiers returned home from one war and entered, quite literally, into another. W.B. Du Bois was not being facetious when he penned his famous May 1919 crisis editorial entitled "Returning Soldiers," when he declared, we return fighting. We return from fighting, we return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States or know the reason why. And this turned out to be the case. And it was by necessity, because many white racists all over the country were ready to fight as well. Racial violence exploded throughout the country after the war, much of it involving African-American veterans and white citizens resistant to any changes, both real or perceived, in the racial status quo. In the South, the number of black people lynched skyrocketed to 76. At least 11 returned black servicemen lost their lives to Southern vigilante violence, some lynched in uniform. Race riots erupted in cities large and small, the most explosive taking place in Washington, D.C., Woodrow Wilson sitting in the White House while African Americans are being assaulted literally across the street, and in Chicago. 38 people died in the Chicago race riot in 1919, but during that particular riot and in others, black people, led by African-American veterans, oftentimes gave as good as they took. Black people fought back, speaking to a new spirit of resistance and self-confidence inspired by the war. But the Red Summer, as James Weldon Johnson characterized it, left a deep scar in the psyches of many African Americans and shaped their memory of the war as one of dashed expectations. As a black veteran of the 93rd Division wrote in a letter after the Chicago riot, quote, "Try to imagine the smoldering hatred within the breast of an overseas veteran who was set upon and mercilessly beaten by a gang of young hoodlums simply because he is colored." That indeed happened in the Chicago race riot. Many African Americans translated this smoldering hatred and the raw memories of democracy denied into organized protest. African American veterans, both physically and symbolically, shaped the upsurge in black radicalism and racial militancy that came to be known as the New Negro Movement. Organizations such as the African Blood Brotherhood, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey, as well as less-known groups like the veteran-led League for Democracy, provided highly politicized former soldiers with vehicles to translate their frustrations into movements for national and international change. So what do we make of this history? This very complex, at times very painful history, but in the hands of many African Americans, very proud history as well. What do we make of the legacy of the war for African Americans and the larger world? By the late 1920s, as racial conditions in the United States had showed no signs of improving, W.B. Du Bois would adopt a very harsh view of the war, going so far as to describe it in his own words, quote, "a scourge, an evil, a retrogression to barbarism, a waste, a wholesale murder." That's how Du Bois described the war by the mid-1920s. And indeed, perhaps it was. Perhaps he was right. But Du Bois also acknowledged that the war and the experiences of black soldiers marked a crucial moment in a longer history and struggle for racial justice. Historians oftentimes point to World War II as the incubus, the birth of the modern civil rights movement. I would argue that we need to go back even further, right? And particularly acknowledge how the memory of the First World War informed the activism of black people during the Second. So the question was raised earlier about Truman, 1948. One of the reasons why he was pressured into desegregating the military was because of veterans from World War I, Rayford Logan. Also African Americans who were active during the First World War, A. Philip Randolph, right, who threatened to engage in civil disobedience against a future draft if the military was not desegregated, right? Drawing explicitly from their experiences during the First World War. Another very important person in that struggle was Charles Hamilton Houston, right? Raise your hand if you've heard of Charles Hamilton Houston. Okay, a few folks, all right. Charles Hamilton Houston was in some ways the father of the modern civil rights movement in terms of his role in the NAACP. Charles Hamilton Houston served as an officer in World War I, was commissioned at Fort Des Moines, was one of the few black officers trained in field artillery, served overseas in France, but emerged from his experience highly embittered. Was furious with the racism that he experienced during the war. Returned back to his home of Washington, D.C., found himself in the midst of the Washington race riot. Right? But he would take those experiences during the war and commit himself to going to law school. Said he never wanted to be caught off guard again without knowing what his rights were. Ended up going to Harvard Law School, would become one of the most significant attorneys in African American history, would train a generation of civil rights attorneys as dean of Howard Law School, including one Thurgood Marshall, first African American to serve on the Supreme Court. And Marshall would, of course, lead the charge against racial segregation, culminating in the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. So perhaps when we think about the civil rights movement, a long civil rights movement, we should point to the experiences of Charles Hamilton Houston and others, point to this period as the pivotal moment in the 20th century where black people began to engage with the meaning of modern democracy and their place in the nation as full and equal citizens in a critical, sustained way. I also think that this story, this part of our history, tells us a lot, can tell us a lot about the meaning of democracy itself, what it has been and what it still must become. As I said earlier, how do we make this relevant to our students today? How do we connect what happened 100 years ago to what is still happening today? Whether we're talking about a street corner on Staten Island, a church in Charleston, South Carolina, or the campus of the University of Missouri. Continued physical and psychic assaults on the lives of black people call into question just what type of country, what type of democracy we live in. Indeed, just as African Americans like W.B. Du Bois asked a century ago, how can we expect to be the global model of freedom, equal justice, and democracy when these ideals cannot be met here at home? We must demand answers to these questions now. Indeed, the memory of African American soldiers in the First World War reminds us that democracy, both practiced and preached by the United States, has been fraught with painful and at times explosive tensions. Du Bois certainly recognized that. The memory of African American soldiers in the First World War reminds us that black lives have and always will continue to matter. And the memory of African American soldiers in the First World War reminds us that democracy has and must continue to be something that is worth fighting for and even dying for as well. So thank you very much.
And we're open for questions.
Okay, let's go.
Wow. Why don't we start on this side?
Okay, well, yes, to my left.
Hi, Jennifer Truman from Bernhardt High School, Angels Camp, California. Of those who went to France, did any stay? And did they stay just in France, or did they go to Great Britain or other places in Europe?
Yes, there were a small number of African American soldiers who did stay in France, some legally, others not so legally. I think the size of the black expatriate community immediately after the war sometimes has been overblown in terms of its numbers, but there were probably certainly a couple dozen African American soldiers who were able to stay in France, who attended French universities, others who found ways to stay over there through clandestine means. A number of the black soldiers who did stay in France took advantage of their musical talents, some open nightclubs, and again, kind of ushering in the jazz age in France. Some did travel to other parts of Europe as well. So yeah, you have the foundation of what would eventually become a incredibly dynamic and truly remarkable African American expatriate community, beginning with those first African American soldiers who stayed in France after the war. And there's certainly a longer history, even predating World War I, of African Americans viewing France kind of as this haven of racial egalitarianism. Right, as a home outside of the United States where African Americans would not be subjected to the type of virulent racism that they experienced in the United States. Now, the reality was that France certainly had its own race problems. The idea of French colorblindness was a myth in many respects. But nevertheless, France kind of takes on this larger kind of symbolic and cultural meaning for African Americans, and the war plays a really important part in that.
Why don't we stay on this side and just make our way around to the other side?
Someone over here?
All right. Richard Vandenbosch, Modesto, California. And I appreciate your talk. You spoke about approximately 80% of the African Americans were used to, quote unquote, take advantage of their natural abilities. What percentage of white soldiers would have served in that capacity? So that way we can kind of juxtapose. If I share that with my students, I can juxtapose.
I unfortunately can't give you an exact percentage. I do know that just in terms of proportion, the number of African Americans who served in the services of supply and other labor capacities was highly disproportionate than other racial groups, including white Americans. So again, there was a clear policy decision that was made that the majority of African American soldiers would serve in labor capacity. You had a number of able-bodied African American who could have served as combatants if there had been other opportunities created. They were not given those opportunities. So again, this kind of goes back to the question that was raised earlier. Did the United States make the best use of all of its available resources? In the case of African American soldiers, certainly not. Yeah.
Hi, Ahmed Prakash, Brooklyn, New York. I was wondering, so the 92nd Division, you had mentioned that it was commanded by white officers. There were some black officers, but mostly white officers. And they were chosen for, quote, their knowledge of handling Negroes was something that was mentioned. And I was wondering, where are they pulling from? Who are the types of people they're recruiting? Because the French, of course, have similar concerns with their colonial troops, and they're pulling exclusively from colonial police and things like that, people with colonial knowledge. So I'm wondering what are the characteristics?
Right. Well, in the case of the 92nd Division, it's important to, I think, remember to take a step back and think about the experience of African American soldiers in the regular Army, the Buffalo Soldiers, how they were also commanded at the highest ranks by white officers. Pershing himself, gets his nickname Blackjack from commanding. He was actually called something else by his fellow white officers. But a lot of the officers who had experience commanding black troops in the regular Army, they were utilized in the 92nd Division and other black combat regiments. There was also the 92nd Division was so fraught with tension because, on the one hand, it was seen as an opportunity for highly ambitious white officers to kind of rise through the ranks quickly, many of whom were more concerned about their own advancement as opposed to the welfare of the soldiers they were commanding. But oftentimes, it was a dumping ground for some of the least competent white officers as well. So that contributed to just the incredibly poor morale that existed within the 92nd Division itself. Many of the labor battalions, including those that remained in the United States, particularly in the South, those were commanded by white, largely non-commissioned officers who were specifically recruited by the military for their experience in overseeing African American laborers, sharecroppers during, prior to the war. So you have these varying experiences as far as white officers commanding black troops are concerned. But again, the main, I think, overarching theme of the military was to make sure that a racial hierarchy remained firmly in place and that black troops were put in a position where they could be as controlled as much as possible. Yes.
Aaron Gullius, Mott Community College. My question is more about Doughboys after the war. I was wondering if anything in his writing sort of brings out anything about how the failure of the proposed racial equality clause in the League of Nations creation and Wilson's role in quashing that, if that might have played into his or other African American leaders' sort of disillusionment at the close of the war.
That's interesting. I haven't seen anything written by Du Bois specifically about that, but he was in France, during the peace negotiations. He was one of the few African Americans who were able to get a passport to go to France. He did not participate, obviously, in the peace proceedings. He used the opportunity to organize a Pan-African Congress, which was used to kind of petition the different representatives at Versailles. They largely ignored, everything that came out of the first Pan-African Congress. This was in February of 1919. So that really kind of began a longer, more gradual process of disillusionment for Du Bois. Certainly the racial violence that happened in the summer of 1919 played a significant part in his frustrations with Wilson personally, but also just with the entire American war effort. I'm currently writing my next book on Du Bois and World War I, so I could go on and on here. But he was incredibly conflicted. As I said, he really put his reputation on the line in supporting the war, in advocating for African Americans to enter the Army, to become officers. He wrote Close Ranks, which, was a complete disaster for him. He spent a large part of the end of the war and the post-war period just trying to rebuild his reputation after that fiasco. So on the one hand, he was trying to find some type of salvation in black participation in the war. But as the years progressed, he could no longer do it. The evidence just didn't support his faith in what the war could have represented. So by the by the mid-1920s, he's thoroughly disgusted with what the war meant and what its legacy was.
Hi, Jean Hamacher again. The 8th Illinois, since we're here in Illinois, can you share a little bit about the experience of the 8th Illinois versus the Harlem Hellfighters? Is there perhaps a Henry Johnson that we don't know about that was in the 8th Illinois?
Certainly, the 8th Illinois, which I think we're talking earlier, has been largely overshadowed by the 369th. The 8th Illinois was the first and the longest standing African American National Guard regiment, played a very significant role in terms of Chicago's black community, especially in the context of the Great Migration and the post-war period, contained black officers, served with distinction in a number of battles during the war. You don't really have a singular figure like Henry Johnson, and again, the 369th being from New York, the New York press, really kind of latching on to the 369th and Johnson in particular. But I think their story is certainly just as, if not more, important than the 369th and other African American National Guard units. Actually, the same day as the homecoming parade of the 369th in New York City, Chicago held a homecoming parade for the 8th Illinois and other black soldiers that was attended by, I believe, over 60,000 people. It was a remarkable scene. So we see how the 8th Illinois was really central to how kind of the post-war memory of the war was shaped specifically in Chicago, and also the role of veterans. In the Chicago race riot, you have the 8th Illinois Armory kind of serving as a staging ground for black troops, arming themselves, literally, getting machine guns and protecting their communities. So they were quite literally on the front lines of protecting black people from racial violence after the war, and serving as communal leaders after the war as well.
Dave King, Tunstall High School, Dry Fork, Virginia. Given his service with the 10th Cavalry and the Indian Wars and San Juan Hill, it seems that Black Jack Pershing was very silent about the situation with African American troops. And also I understand I wonder why he didn't demand the regular units, the 9th and 10th and the 24th and 25th, trained troops to serve in the Army.
Right. Yeah, well, Pershing, he's an interesting case. I think he believed that African American soldiers could be effective combatants, but he also believed that they needed to be commanded by white officers. He never had full confidence in African-American officers, leading black troops into battle. I think part of his decision in not utilizing the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry was, again, this fear of racial friction, of destabilizing the status quo, and also wanting to maintain the support of other white officers in the military. I mean, he wasn't the most popular guy, and there were a lot of officers who did not like him, who were resentful, that he was, elevated to the position that he attained. So I think he kind of walked this balance of, on the one hand, wanting to be supportive of African-American troops based on his own experience, his own knowledge of them personally, but also realizing that he could not go too far, lest he alienate many of the white officers, many of whom were from the South. Right, and the type of unrest that could potentially lead to within the AEF. So he was, I think, on the whole, conciliatory to the white officers and what that meant for the treatment of black officers, which on the whole was largely negative. A few other questions, yes.
Chris Hughes, the Stanwich School, Greenwich, Connecticut. Was the African American experience with other services similar to their experience in the Army? In terms of, in the Navy, were there any black Marines? And then
no black Marines. There were no African Americans who served in kind of the nascent American Air Force. Actually, one of the most kind of remarkable stories of black participation in the war involved Eugene Bullard. He was known by the French as the Black Swallow of Death. It was a great nickname. He was actually the first African-American fighter pilot who fought with the French, was not able to serve with the American forces. The role of African Americans in the Navy during the war, something that I think, if anybody's, interested in exploring that more, a topic that still needs much more attention. I mean, there were African Americans who served in the Navy. They served largely menial positions as messmen. And their experiences were unique, but also highly circumscribed as well. I mean, they didn't have many opportunities for advancement, and were again kept in their place, so to speak. Yeah. And again, this kind of speaks to the larger racist traditions in the United States Navy specifically.
A colleague told me of an interesting link between the First World War and later events, and that is that Emmett Till's father served in France, and I believe was charged with rape and perhaps convicted and perhaps even executed in France, and that's a very interesting link. Can you tell us more?
Well, in my book, I investigated the charges against African Americans for rape. As I said, the majority were largely unsubstantiated. I believe there were, and I may be missing the number, roughly 10 or 11 formal executions of black soldiers on charges of rape. Again, the way that those proceedings were adjudicated raises significant questions about military justice. I mean, in large part, we're effectively talking about legal lynchings here. But I think that is a fascinating connection. You're right. It does, again, speak to these continuums that we need to acknowledge between the First World War, between the Second World War, and what we often recognize as the modern civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, how these memories of black participation in the military, and specifically the treatment of black veterans, serves to galvanize these moments of civil rights activism and protest, right? So the symbolism of the black soldier, the symbolism of the black veteran, right? The symbolism of the abused black soldier and black veteran, right? Just how symbolically potent that is, and how African Americans, certainly after the First World War, but also after the Second World War, really pointed to that as a rationale for how America had to change, right? I mean, how the status quo was unsustainable. Yeah.
We'll take one more question, Tom Daniel.
Yes, Tom Daniel, Davidson High School, Mobile, Alabama. I'm also a retired captain in the U.S. Navy, so I think I can address, and I'd like to address the comment that was made, or the question that was made about the Navy. The Navy was a generation behind the U.S. Army. As you indicated, the U.S. Army had their first minority commissioned officers in 1917. The U.S. Navy didn't have their first minority commissioned officers until 1944. The Army had its first African-American general, Brigadier General Benjamin Davis, I believe in 1941-42. The U.S. Navy didn't have its first African-American admiral, Rear Admiral Gravely, until 1972. But the good news is the Navy has come a long way, and currently the U.S. Navy has Admiral Michelle Howard, African-American female, as the #2 officer in the U.S. Navy. And she was considered last year for the top job for the Chief of Naval Operations, but she's a very junior 4-star admiral, and she will be a contender next time around. It's a 4-year position. So the Navy has come a long way, but basically a generation behind the Army.
Definitely, yeah. And I think when we're talking about especially the contemporary African-American military experience, talking about the role of African-American women is absolutely critical given their disproportionate numbers as far as the role of women in our military today. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.